Hey puzzlers, this is Steve here with another video on how to solve some logic puzzles. This one's known as tents. How it works is you're going to be tying a tent to each tree, and tents cannot be adjacent to one another, not even diagonally, and the numbers along the outside of the grid indicate how many tents are in that given row or column. What I'm going to do is try to solve this example puzzle for you guys so you can kind of see how it unravels, and I'll share some common tips and tricks along the way that'll hopefully make it easier for you to solve this type of puzzle yourself in the future. Now, this is from a great website that has a ton of fun puzzles. I'll post a link in the description below so you can try it out yourself. Now, without further ado, where would you start first? It's going to be where the zeros are, right? This column here we know has no tents, so we can X all of those out. And this row here, same thing, make all of those green. Same thing with this zero, there's no tents. So that's a great place to start. The other place I would look is areas where trees are kind of cornered or pigeonholed, where it's really constrained. So a perfect example is this tree here only has one open cell and it needs a tent. So that must be the tent. And that tent is tied to this tree. So we ask ourselves, what about this tree? This tree needs a tent and can't share this tent. Each tree needs its own tent tied to it. So there's only one cell open for it, so that must be a tent there. And whenever we place a tent, we know all the cells adjacent to it, and that one as well, cannot contain a tent. Tents cannot be next to one another, so we know we could X all those out. And then we see a very constrained tree here. There's only one orthogonally adjacent cell that's open, so that must be a tent. And whenever you see cells like this that is not orthogonally adjacent to any tree, you know a tent can't be there. Same thing like here, here, there's a lot of cells that can't contain tents because they're not going to be next to any trees, or at least not orthogonally. And so you could kind of X those out. Those are gimmies. Now, if we see this tree here, this is really constrained, and in fact, this whole column, we need two more tents to make it 4. We have 1, 2. There's only 2 more spots left, so both of those must be tents there to make it 4. Now, I didn't notice, but I now am seeing that this 2 row is solved. We already have 1, 2 tents, so we can X out all those other cells. Or make it green, I guess it's grass. Where else would I look? So typically these big numbers are going to be more constrained than the smaller ones. So what we do is we look at the maximum and the minimum possibilities. This 4, we need 3 more tents. Well, we could have a tent here, we can have a tent here, we could have a tent here, here, or here. So if we think about it, we're going to need most of those. We can't place the tent here because what would end up happening is the adjacent cells would not contain a tent, and we would only be able to place one more. That would only be 3, right? 1, 2, plus the whichever one this tree has. And so this here cannot be a tent. And since this cannot be a tent, these 2 must be, and that makes your 4 there. Now this tree is constrained. There's only one open space for the tent, must be there. And in fact, this 3, all of these open spaces must be tents. Now sometimes when you're doing these tent puzzles, you may find the location of a tent but don't know which tree it belongs to, and that's okay. Like we look at this tree here and you say, well, which tent belongs to this tree? It doesn't necessarily matter always. Here you can clearly see that this tent belongs to this tree because this tent belongs to that tree, but that's not so important, at least not always. So don't get caught up too much. Sometimes you can find the location of a tent without necessarily knowing which tree it belongs to, and that's fine. This 1 column is solved. We have 1 tent already in the column, so we can X out all those other cells. Now, let's think about this 4. This 4 is the bottom row. It's pretty constrained. We have 1. We need 3 more. At most, 1 can be here. 2. So if we count, so a tent can go here or here, but it can't be both because they would be adjacent to one another. So what I do when I'm counting the maximum possibilities is whenever there's 2 cells right next to each other that can contain a tent, I count that as 1 rather than 2. So we have at most 1, 2, 3, because again, you can't have both. And so in fact, this has to be a tent, this has to be a tent, and one of these is going to be a tent, but we don't know which one. But either way, we know this cell can't be, right? Because if we put a tent here and a tent there, those are adjacent to one another. That wouldn't work. Same thing, if we put a tent here and a tent there, those are adjacent to one another. That wouldn't work. So we know this cannot be a tent. And therefore, this tree now only has one open space for a tent, and it must be there, which now solves this tree, because we can't have tents adjacent to one another. So this tree must have the tent up here, which solves this 1. And this 4 is also solved. 1, 2, 3, 4. And so there you go. Now this 2 column, we have 1 tent. We need 1 more. There's only 1 space. So that's it. This 2 column solved. We have 1, 2 already in that column. Same thing with this 2. There's already 2 in that column. And now if we think about this tree already has its tent. So this cell up here can't be a tent. Otherwise, you'd have 2 tents tied to the same tree. And so if we think about this 1 row now, there's only 1 space left. That must be a tent to satisfy this 1 clue. We now know these 2 cells can't be tents because they're adjacent to this one. And this 2 column has 1. The second one must go there. This 3 has 1, 2. We need a third, which must go there. So this tent is tied to this tree. This tent is tied to this tree. So this cell here can't be a tent. Otherwise, you'd have 2 tents tied to the same tree. And so now the last tent goes right there to solve this 2 clue. And that's it. So hopefully that made sense for you guys. Lots of fun. I really like tent puzzles. They're a lot like a battleship puzzles or rain clouds, where basically you're trying to find objects within the grid by using the clues. Definitely enjoyable. I would recommend checking it out. Again, hit the link in the description below to go to the website. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.